The snow fell in thick, soft flakes that December night, blanketing the quiet streets of the small Midwestern town of Pine Hollow. It was Christmas Eve, and every house on Main Street glowed with warm, twinkling lights. Through the frosted windows of the St. Andrew's Church, the faint notes of carolers echoed into the night, their voices filled with holiday cheer. Families gathered, children clutched candles, and Pastor Michael prepared to deliver his traditional Christmas Eve sermon, a message of hope, renewal, and the unexpected miracles life can bring. The world seemed perfectly at peace, but outside, amidst the snowdrifts and biting cold, a frail figure struggled against the wind. A stray cat, its fur matted and dusted with frost. She was impossibly thin, her ribs jutting out beneath a patchy coat. Her small, fragile paws were red and cracked from the icy pavement. For days, she had wandered the town unnoticed, skirting the edges of alleys and darting away from the occasional sound of footsteps. Her golden eyes were dim with exhaustion, but there was something in them that refused to give up. She stopped near the church, her body trembling from the cold. Her breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps. The warmth of the light spilling out from the windows beckoned her, and she pressed forward, paw by paw, leaving a faint trail of blood against the pristine white snow. When she reached the stone steps of the church, she let out a small, rasping cry, a pitiful sound, almost drowned out by the wind. It was her last hope. She cried again and again, her tiny voice shaking in the cold, praying someone inside would hear her. Inside the church, a little girl named Grace sat in the front pew, clutching her grandmother's hand. Grace was only 6 years old, her bright red hair tied up in pigtails, but her sharp ears caught the faintest sound of the cat's cries. She turned to her grandmother, her green eyes wide with concern. "Did you hear that, Nana? It sounds like someone's hurt." Her grandmother smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from Grace's forehead. "It's probably just the wind, sweetheart. The storm's getting worse." But Grace wasn't convinced. She turned in her seat and glanced at the church doors, her small brow furrowing in concentration. The sound came again, a feeble mew that tugged at her heart. She slipped off the pew and tugged at her grandmother's hand. "Please, Nana, we have to check. It sounds like it needs help." Reluctantly, her grandmother rose, and the two made their way to the heavy oak doors of the church. Grace pushed them open with all her might, and a gust of cold air rushed in, making everyone inside shiver. Standing there on the threshold, illuminated by the golden light of the church, was the cat. Her legs wobbled, and she collapsed onto the snowy steps, too weak to take another step. Gasps filled the room as the congregation turned to see what had caused the commotion. Grace knelt down in the snow, her little hands reaching out to the trembling creature. Her grandmother placed a hand on her shoulder, her voice soft with concern. "Careful, Grace. She might be sick." "She's not scary, Nana," Grace said firmly. "She's just cold and hungry. We have to help her." The cat's golden eyes flickered open, locking onto Grace's face for just a moment before closing again. It was as if she knew she was finally safe. Pastor Michael approached, his brow furrowed. "Bring her inside. We can't leave her out here in this storm." Carefully, Grace and her grandmother carried the cat into the church, wrapping her in a soft blanket from the nativity scene. The congregation watched in silence, their carols forgotten as they witnessed this small act of compassion unfold. Inside, the warmth of the church began to thaw the ice that had clung to the cat's fur. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. But as Pastor Michael leaned down to examine her more closely, his face darkened with concern. "She's in bad shape," he said quietly, looking at Grace's grandmother. "I'm not sure she'll make it through the night." The little girl's voice was steady as she looked up at him, her arms wrapped protectively around the fragile creature. "She will, Pastor. It's Christmas. This is the time for miracles." The room fell silent. The churchgoers, one by one, began to approach the cat, offering blankets, food, and prayers. Even the coldest hearts in the room seemed to soften at the sight of the helpless creature, her life hanging by a thread. Unbeknownst to them all, this cat had a story, one that would soon come to light, breaking every heart in the room and reminding them of the true meaning of Christmas. The stray cat lay motionless on a thick woolen blanket near the church's nativity scene. Beside her, a small bowl of warm milk and a piece of leftover turkey sat untouched, despite the comforting glow of candlelight and the crackling warmth of the church's fireplace. Her fragile body seemed to teeter on the edge of life and death. Her golden eyes fluttered open briefly but closed again, as if even the act of staying awake required more strength than she had to give. Grace sat cross-legged beside her, her tiny hand resting gently on the cat's side. She was quiet, her lips moving in a whispered prayer. "Please, God, help her," Grace murmured, her voice trembling. "She's all alone, and it's Christmas. She doesn't deserve to feel this way." Pastor Michael and Grace's grandmother watched from a few feet away, their concern growing with each passing minute. The congregation had mostly dispersed, returning to their homes for Christmas Eve festivities. But a handful of parishioners stayed behind, their faces drawn with worry. It wasn't just the cat's condition that weighed on them. It was the peculiar air of sadness that seemed to radiate from her. It was as though she carried the weight of something far greater than hunger and cold. A woman named Lydia, one of the church's longtime volunteers, stepped forward and knelt beside the cat. Lydia had a gentle demeanor, her gray hair pinned neatly into a bun and her soft hands worn from years of caring for others. She examined the cat's frail body and frowned. "Look at her paws," Lydia said softly. "They're raw and bleeding. She's been walking for miles, poor thing." "But why?" Grace asked, her green eyes filling with tears. "Why would she walk so far if she's so sick?" No one had an answer. The room fell silent except for the faint crackle of the fire and the soft hum of wind outside. As the hours ticked by, the cat began to stir slightly, her weak body responding to the warmth and the food she had finally managed to nibble. But even as her physical strength returned in tiny increments, there was an unshakable sense of sadness in her golden eyes. Later that night, as the church emptied and only Grace, her grandmother, and Pastor Michael remained, the cat let out a low, mournful cry. It was unlike any meow they had ever heard, long, hollow, and filled with unmistakable anguish. She struggled to her feet, wobbling unsteadily as if she were trying to go somewhere. "She's trying to tell us something," Grace said, her voice trembling with conviction. "Or maybe she's just confused," Pastor Michael offered, though he sounded unsure himself. The cat took a few shaky steps toward the door, turned back, and cried again. Her golden eyes met Grace's, pleading. "She wants us to follow her," Grace said firmly. Her grandmother hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was nearing midnight, and the snow outside was piling up fast. "Grace, it's late, and it's freezing out there. She needs to rest." But Grace shook her head. "Nana, please. She came here for a reason. She walked through the snow and the cold because she needed help. What if she's trying to show us why?" Pastor Michael exchanged a glance with Grace's grandmother and nodded. "I'll go with her, just to see. If the cat needs something, we should at least try." Bundling up in heavy coats and scarves, they carefully lifted the cat and placed her inside a padded carrier. Grace insisted on holding it herself, despite its weight, and the three of them ventured out into the storm. The wind howled around them, whipping snow into their faces as they trudged through the knee-deep drifts. At first, the cat seemed disoriented, meowing weakly from within the carrier. But soon, she began to scratch at the door, her cries growing louder, more urgent. Following her cues, Grace directed them down the road, through an empty field, and toward the edge of town. The journey felt endless. Grace's fingers were numb from gripping the carrier, and her grandmother stumbled more than once on the uneven ground. Just when they thought they couldn't go any farther, the cat let out a sharp, piercing yowl and began clawing frantically at the carrier door. "There," Pastor Michael pointed. In the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow, was the faint outline of an old, abandoned barn. Its roof sagged under the weight of years and neglect, and its windows were broken, allowing the cold to sweep freely through its walls. They approached cautiously, the crunch of snow beneath their boots the only sound aside from the wind. When they reached the barn, Grace opened the carrier and gently lifted the cat out. Though weak, the cat wriggled free from her grasp and bolted toward the barn's entrance, disappearing into the darkness. "Wait!" Grace called, running after her. Inside, the barn was colder than they expected, the air heavy with the smell of damp wood and decay. The cat stood in the middle of the room, her golden eyes locked on a pile of old hay in the corner. She let out another low, mournful cry, her thin body trembling with urgency. Pastor Michael approached cautiously, using his flashlight to illuminate the pile. As the beam of light landed on it, a collective gasp escaped their lips. There, nestled among the hay, was a litter of tiny kittens, 5 in total. Their small bodies were huddled together for warmth, their fur damp from the snow that had blown in through the broken walls. They were barely alive, their tiny chests rising and falling in shallow breaths. "Oh my God," Grace's grandmother whispered, her hand covering her mouth. The stray cat nudged one of the kittens gently with her nose before collapsing beside them, her body curled protectively around her babies. She had been searching for help, not for herself, but for them. Tears streamed down Grace's face as she knelt beside the cat. "She came all this way to save them," she whispered. The gravity of what they were witnessing hit them all at once. This fragile, broken creature had pushed herself to the brink of death to protect her babies, walking miles through the freezing cold, guided only by sheer love and determination. Pastor Michael's voice broke the silence, trembling with emotion. "We need to get them out of here, now." The barn was bitterly cold, its broken windows allowing the howling wind to sweep in unrelentingly. Pastor Michael, Grace, and her grandmother stood frozen for a moment, staring at the heartbreaking sight before them. The mother cat, so weak she could barely lift her head, had curled herself tightly around her kittens, her body trembling as she tried to shield them from the cold. The kittens, no larger than the palm of Grace's hand, let out faint, pitiful squeaks, their tiny mouths opening and closing in desperation. Grace's breath came out in a cloud of mist, her tears freezing on her cheeks as she knelt beside the cat. "We have to help them, Pastor," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to." "We will," Pastor Michael said, his voice firm despite the emotion in his eyes. He glanced around the barn. "But we can't keep them here. They won't survive another hour in this cold." Grace's grandmother nodded, already shrugging off her heavy coat. She spread it over the kittens and the mother cat, wrapping them as gently as she could. "We'll take them back to the church. It's warm there, and we can keep them safe until morning." Carefully, they bundled the cat and her kittens into the coat, tucking the fabric around them to protect them from the icy wind. Grace held the makeshift bundle close to her chest as they made their way back through the storm, her small arms aching but steady. She didn't complain once, even as the snow stung her face and her feet slipped on the icy ground. When they finally returned to St. Andrew's Church, the warmth of the interior felt like a blessing. They placed the mother cat and her kittens near the fireplace, laying them on a bed of soft blankets. The kittens barely moved, their tiny bodies cold to the touch, and the mother cat let out a faint, guttural cry, as if begging them to save her babies. "We need to warm them up," Lydia said, returning to the church after hearing about the rescue. She knelt beside the kittens and began rubbing their tiny bodies with a soft towel. "They're so cold. Their little hearts can't take it much longer." Grace's grandmother brewed a warm mixture of milk and water, using a small syringe to drip it carefully into the kittens' mouths. Pastor Michael fetched a space heater from the storage closet, positioning it near the blankets to create a cocoon of warmth around the fragile family. Hours passed, each moment filled with painstaking care and whispered prayers. Grace refused to leave the kitten's side, her tiny hands stroking their fur as she murmured words of encouragement. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You have to be okay. Your mama worked so hard to save you." But as the night stretched on, the enormity of the situation began to weigh on them all. The mother cat's breaths were shallow and labored, her strength nearly gone after the harrowing journey. She rested her head on Grace's lap, her golden eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and trust. It was Lydia who finally broke the silence, her voice trembling. She must have been searching for days, she said. No food, no shelter, and in this storm. She shook her head, tears filling her eyes. She gave everything she had to keep them alive. Pastor Michael's brow furrowed in thought. And she came here to the church. Of all the places she could have gone, she chose this one. Maybe, he hesitated, his voice softening. Maybe she knew we'd help her. Grace looked up at him, her green eyes wide, like she was guided here by God. The room fell silent as the weight of Grace's words settled over them. It was a thought too profound to ignore. Just then, one of the kittens let out a faint mewl, its tiny voice breaking the stillness. Grace gasped, her heart leaping in her chest. "It's moving," she cried. The kitten wriggled slightly, its tiny paws stretching as warmth returned to its body. Another kitten followed, then another, their fragile movements sparking hope in the room. Grace's grandmother smiled through her tears, her hands clasped together in silent prayer. But the mother cat remained still, her energy depleted. She opened her eyes briefly, watching as her kittens began to stir, then closed them again, her body slackening against the blankets. "No!" Grace cried, her voice breaking. She leaned over the cat, tears streaming down her face. "You can't leave them. They still need you." Pastor Michael knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "She's done so much, Grace, more than anyone could have asked of her. But sometimes," he paused, his voice thick with emotion, "sometimes love means giving everything you have, even if it means letting go." Grace sobbed, clutching the mother cat's paw. "But it's Christmas," she whispered. "This is supposed to be a time for miracles." As if in answer to her plea, the mother cat stirred faintly, her golden eyes opening one last time. She looked at Grace, her gaze soft and filled with a quiet strength. Then she turned her head toward her kittens, who were now wriggling and mewing beside her. A faint purr rumbled in her chest, weak but steady, a sound of reassurance. "She's not giving up," Lydia said softly. "Not yet." The next few hours were a blur of care and worry. The kittens grew stronger with each passing moment, their tiny cries filling the room with life. The mother cat, though still weak, began to nibble at small pieces of food, her strength returning bit by bit. By the time the first rays of dawn broke through the stained glass windows of the church, the mother cat had managed to sit up, her body curled protectively around her kittens. The congregation, returning for the Christmas morning service, gasped at the sight. Whispers spread through the room as they learned of the cat's journey and the incredible love that had driven her to save her babies. "She's a miracle," someone said. "No," Grace replied, her voice clear and steady. "She's a mama, and love is the real miracle." The morning light filled St. Andrew's Church with a soft, golden glow, illuminating the once frozen family of cats now nestled together in their makeshift bed by the fire. The congregation, gathered for the Christmas Day service, approached the scene quietly, their faces a mix of awe and tenderness. The kittens were no longer lifeless. They squirmed and mewled softly, their tiny paws kneading the blankets. Their mother, though visibly exhausted, sat upright for the first time, licking each of them in turn with deliberate care. Her golden eyes glimmered faintly with relief, though her frailty remained evident. Grace stayed by their side, her heart bursting with a mixture of joy and protectiveness. She had barely slept, but she didn't care. The sight of the kittens alive and warm was all the Christmas gift she needed. She looked up at Pastor Michael, her green eyes filled with determination. "We need to find them a home," she said firmly. Pastor Michael smiled, his eyes crinkling at the edges. "One thing at a time, Grace. Let's make sure they're strong enough first." As the congregation took their seats for the service, Pastor Michael decided to change his sermon for the morning. Instead of delivering the prepared message about the birth of Christ, he told the story of the stray cat, the desperate mother who had wandered through a storm to save her babies. "This cat didn't just find us," Pastor Michael said, his voice resonating through the small church. "She came here because she knew she couldn't do it alone. She came here out of faith. Faith that someone would help her, that someone would care. And isn't that what Christmas is all about? Trusting that love will meet us in our hardest moments, Even when we've reached the very end of what we can bear, the congregation listened in rapt silence, many dabbing at their eyes with tissues. The story touched something deep within them. It wasn't just about the cat. It was about the power of love, sacrifice, and the ways in which even the smallest lives can remind us of what truly matters. After the service, people lingered to check on the cat and her kittens. Gifts of food, blankets, and small donations began to pile up near the fireplace. A local veterinarian, Dr. Bennett, stepped forward from the crowd, her kind face alight with purpose. "I heard about what happened," Dr. Bennett said, kneeling to examine the cat and her babies. "I'll take them to my clinic. They'll need care, especially the mother. She's severely malnourished, and it's a miracle she survived the storm." Grace's lip trembled, her small hands clutching the edge of the blanket. "Will they be okay?" Dr. Bennett smiled gently. "They're fighters, Grace. With some time and care, I think they'll make a full recovery." The mother cat looked up at Grace as if she understood every word, her golden eyes filled with trust. Grace knelt down, pressing her forehead gently against the cat's. "You're so brave," she whispered. "I'm going to miss you." Dr. Bennett carefully placed the family of cats into a carrier and promised to update the church on their progress. As she drove away, the church felt quieter without them, but the story of their survival lingered in everyone's hearts. Weeks passed, and the harshness of winter slowly gave way to the first signs of spring. Grace visited Dr. Bennett's clinic often, bringing little toys and treats for the kittens. Under the veterinarian's care, the mother cat, whom Grace had named Hope, regained her strength. Her fur, once patchy and dull, grew soft and thick, and her golden eyes sparkled with life again. The kittens thrived, tumbling over each other in playful chaos, their tiny meows filling the clinic with joy. One afternoon, as Grace sat on the floor of the clinic playing with the kittens, Dr. Bennett approached her with a warm smile. "I have some good news," Dr. Bennett said. "We found families for all the kittens. They're going to wonderful homes." Grace's smile faltered for a moment. She loved each kitten dearly and would miss them, but she nodded. "That's good," she said softly. "They deserve to be happy." Dr. Bennett hesitated, then crouched down beside her. And as for Hope, Grace's heart clenched. "She's going to a home too, isn't she?" Dr. Bennett smiled. "That's up to you." Grace's eyes widened. "Me? I spoke to your grandmother," Dr. Bennett explained. "She said you've been asking for a pet for months. If you want to adopt Hope, she's yours." Tears filled Grace's eyes as she looked at the cat, who was watching her with calm, steady eyes from across the room. She didn't hesitate. "I want her. I want her more than anything." That Easter, Hope officially became a part of Grace's family. The once stray cat who had wandered through a storm, half dead and desperate, now spent her days lounging in sunbeams and curling up in Grace's lap. The bond between them was unshakable. On quiet nights, as Grace drifted off to sleep, Hope would climb onto her bed and nuzzle close, her purring a soothing reminder of the miracle that had brought them together. But Hope's story didn't end there. Her resilience and sacrifice had inspired the entire town of Pine Hollow. St. Andrew's Church started a community fund in her honor, raising money to care for stray and abandoned animals. The story of Hope the Christmas cat became a cherished local legend, a reminder of the power of love and the miracles that can happen when compassion meets action. And Grace, now older and wiser, never forgot the lesson Hope taught her that Christmas Eve. That sometimes, love means giving everything you have, even when the odds are against you. And in the end, that love always comes back tenfold. As the years went by, the story of Hope and her kittens remained a treasured memory for the people of Pine Hollow. Every Christmas Eve, Pastor Michael would recount their tale during the service, reminding the congregation of the stray cat who had walked through a blizzard to save her babies. It became more than just a story about a mother's love. It became a symbol of the quiet miracles that surround us, the strength to keep going when the world seems too cold to bear, and the faith that someone, somewhere, will answer the call for help. For Grace, Hope was more than a pet. She was a part of her soul. The once fragile cat grew healthy and strong, her golden eyes always watching over Grace with unwavering devotion. On stormy winter nights, when the wind howled through the trees, Grace would wrap her arms around Hope and whisper, "You're my Christmas miracle." And Hope, as if she understood, would press her head against Grace's chest, her purring a steady, comforting rhythm. The town of Pine Hollow changed because of Hope. Stray animals were no longer ignored. They were seen, cared for, and loved. The community fund established in Hope's name grew into a full animal shelter, saving countless lives over the years. Her legacy became a living, breathing testament to the idea that even the smallest acts of compassion can create ripples of kindness far beyond what we can imagine. And every Christmas morning, without fail, Grace would find Hope sitting by the window, her golden eyes gazing out at the snow-covered world. It was as if she remembered that night, the cold, the struggle, and the warmth that finally saved her. Grace would sit beside her, wrapping an arm around her soft fur, and they would watch the snow together, their hearts full of gratitude. For Grace, for Hope, and for the entire town of Pine Hollow, that Christmas Eve wasn't just a night of rescue. It was a night that reminded them all of the true meaning of the season. Love, sacrifice, and the belief that even in the darkest moments, light will always find a way through. Because sometimes, miracles don't come as grand gestures or flashes of divine light. Sometimes, they come quietly, on tiny, frost-bitten paws, with golden eyes full of hope.